Visst, visst.
Hello and most welcome
Förbindelse är
to...
lite dålig, men du kan köra på. Du
Hello.
fryser ibland på min skärm, men det spelar ingen roll.
Hello
Jo,
and
det spelar
most
roll.
welcome to Heidegger 1779. And we will today make just a little short of Baron Goldfarb's very interesting Wittgenstein on understanding. He needs to go away pretty soon, so it will be a short one. Hopefully we can continue tomorrow. I will just mention to Kalle here that before we end, we together, might have classes tomorrow. So if it were to be possible to extend tomorrow's time, it would be nice. But about that later. Last time we start looking at a priorism. This is the beef that Wittgenstein has with the current philosophy. A prioritism means that, so to speak, everything is predestined to be, that there are no options in reality. And we also know how knowledge develops. So we know intimately before knowledge has even come to us how it will develop. It's a sort of mysterious precognition that gives us mysterious hints that we then can use. Warren Goldfarb calls this priorism or priorism, or the very fact that I personally, or together with other people, decide the development of knowledge, what understanding is. And this is, of course, mighty interesting because this is what caused from the beginning the closing of the Western mind. I had a little exchange with the excellent reader and thinker Let Dasein Live, and looking at, for instance, the state of science today, it is most limited. Scientists have been relegated to the position of being merely teachers of what is already established, because the establishment makes no or very little room for anything new to happen, anything to be developed, or that nothing will, so to say, surprise us. It is massively dependent on what has happened before and absolutely dependent on some sort of laws or a priori development that we know from the beginning. This, as I claimed last time, is not the case with Ludwig Wittgenstein. He rather operates case by case, having no generalized or universalized laws at all. Everything is unique in themselves. Do not follow suit, prearranged or preemptive thoughts. If one wants to do like we mentioned before in the book of Revelation. There was some nice words here. That the scroll was full of sorrow, lament, and that it is the action partner with the demons. Let's add that. This is what we are placed within. The pre-established picture makes all movement in our thinking absolutely impossible. Everything is fixed, no movement whatsoever, nothing new can enter, there's no creativity. Our thinking is just passively following suit of what is preordained by the previous states of the world. Nothing new can enter. And it's also this utterly weird thing that reality must be in a certain way. It doesn't have options. This non-optionality, it's pretty massive. We can now continue because now we're going into the most interesting turning folks noted in perfect pitch. And this is an example by Warren Goldfarb himself. And we continue on page 114. And we are currently on page 114. It's beginning. I could not tell from this what mental tuning forks were, but that would probably emerge from the empirical evidence for the claim. The evidence turned out to be as follows. There's a certain brainwave called P300, which has been claimed to be associated with memory. Subjects with perfect pitch, when asked to identify the pitches of tunes, play to them, have a small or absent P300 brainwave, whereas those without perfect pitch had larger P300. The cognitive scientist took this to mean that the latter were reaching into memory in order to compare what they heard with a remembered standard. The absence of P300 in subjects with perfect pitch was the sole evidential basis for the claim of mental tuning forks. The argument seems to be this: those who use memory use it for a remembered standard. Those with perfect pitch do not use memory. Therefore, they must have a standard not in memory, thus mental tuning forks. Tuning forks, are they sounding all the time? If so, what cacophony? How does the subject know which fork's pitch to pick out of the cacophony when confronted with a tone to identify? If they are not always sounding, how does she know which one to sound when confronted with the tone? And if she sounds one and it is too low, what tells her that it is too low? What gives her instructions as to which fork to sound next? Does she have internal ordered pairs of tuning forks which give her the standards for higher and lower, so that she may compare tuning forks with the tone she heard? But how does that help, since she still, and here it comes, she still has to compare the tone with a member of the ordered pair? I admit that the expression mental tuning forks occurred only in a newspaper article, not in the research report published in the journal Science. The latter was more restrained and concluded. Subjects with this skill have access to permanently resident representations of the tones, so they do not need, as the rest of us do, to fetch and compare representations for novel stimuli. Permanently resident representations here are the tuning forks of the newspaper article, the standards not in memory. But clearly the same questions arise about such representations, even without the picturesque language. Real tuning forks give us the means to identify pitches, but they do so because we have the practices and abilities to use them. The internal standard is supposed to give us the means to identify items, but without practice and abilities, for the internal standard is also meant to operate by itself in a self-sufficient manner. If it were not, it would be otiose. Why not settle for practices and abilities themselves? It hardly adds explanatory value to say, instead of she can recognize that as middle C, she has permanently resident mental tuning fork at middle C and can recognize when a tone is the same as that. In short, the internal mental determinant is imagined on the model of external standards, but in the absence of the surroundings that make the standards into standards. This is how the model is misconstrued. The case of mental tuning forks, despite its foolishness, is similar to more serious ones. The question that point out the misconstrual here are congruent to the third man type arguments Wittgenstein invokes with respect to samples, signposts, mental pictures, and rooms. The same move is made in construing understanding. The notion of the self-sufficient state is just the notion of an internal representation that legislates all the individual uses. It is just the idea that recognition must involve comparison to a standard. Wittgenstein's point is to expose its incoherence. Here, however, the scientific objector has a resort. Once physical science is in play, causal notions become available. Thus, the incoherence can be avoided. What is being imagined as being in principle discoverable is not some confused notion of standard or representation, but a physical state that will cause the manifestations of understanding. Now the notion of cause can seem inapposite at this juncture. That is, as that which will first give sense to the determination by the understanding of what counts as a manifestation of the understanding. None of its ordinary scientific surroundings are in place. The notion of the standard that legislates the uses, one might think, would have to be given first. Only then the scientific or scientistically inclined would urge an empirical investigation to see how this works. Wittgenstein's attack is on this prior notion. For this reason, I think Wittgenstein tends not to take seriously the idea of using causal notions. His interlocutor at paragraph 195 says, I don't mean that what I do now in grasping something determines the future use causally and as a matter of experience. But that in a queer way, the use itself is in some sense present, and Wittgenstein agrees that causal notions are not at issue. Nonetheless, one might want to examine more closely what the imagined causal location is. Any relation between understanding and manifestation has little of the invariability that a straightforwardly causal relation would entail. I do not produce manifestations of my understanding at all times. I may not want to. I may be bored. I may make a mistake. I may have misheard what you said. I may be making a joke or pulling your leg. Thus, any causal story has now to bring in other factors, e.g., my belief that you asked thus and so, my attentiveness, my desire to manifest my understanding correctly, and so on. In order to establish some hint of law-like regularity, Each of these other factors now must be imagined to be scientifically discovered as distinct, definite, particular states, presumably independent of the state of understanding. Clearly, we have little clue as to how such states will be identified. After all, these factors have been specified so far only in a circular fashion via the assessment of the behavior as a manifestation of correct understanding. The point here is to show how much is glossed over in the retort, how little we have a grasp on what we are meant to be imagining. Yet another reaction to the objector's recourse to causal relations is grounded on what I called the second strand in Wittgenstein's efforts to undermine the notion of a particular state or process as constituting understanding. That strand concerns the range of practices relevant to ascriptions of understanding. I have been talking simplistically of manifestations of understanding as if all that were involved were correct uses of the understood word. But in fact, a major part of Wittgenstein's considerations are to get us to see the enormous variety of features that play a role in our ascriptions of understanding or lack of understanding, and the dependence of these particularities of the context in which the ascription is made. There's no short repertoire of behavioral manifestations. There is enormous play in what understanding can be said to come to or not in different circumstances. An ascription of understanding can rely on features of the subject far beyond the immediate manifestations. Different performances are required of new learners and old hands. Character traits, mental states of all kinds, intentional, emotional, perceptual, and personal history of the subject can be relevant. Special circumstances of considerable intricacy can affect an ascription of understanding. To use Wittgenstein's well-chosen example on page 59 of the investigations, think of the cases in which it would be legitimate to speak of an interruption of understanding. More generally, one might reflect on the very different ways in which mistakes can affect ascriptions. For example, the ways we distinguish between errors arising from carelessness and, listen now, errors arising from misunderstanding. In short, the difference that can emerge in circumstances are overwhelmingly complex and inhomogeneous. Different cases of understanding may have little in common. Wittgenstein exploits considerations along these lines in many ways in his general attack. The variegation and lack of uniformity make clear how far any unitary state or process is from what we observe in the cases of understanding, and thus emphasizes the leap made in postulating such a hidden state of process. Any of the features that play a role in an ascription of understanding would have to be construed as evidence for this hidden state. But our grasp on the state evidence model is cast into doubt by the variability of what and when any particular feature functions as evidence. For we lack any conception of how the state is connected to just the particular things that matter in a particular context. If we say that in each particular case there is some particular connection, then all we are saying is that the particular circumstances justify me in my ascription. The one state drops out. But what conception can we have of a general connection that issues in such variability? It begins to look as if in each instance the state must include, in some sense of include, something answering to any features that could possibly arise in any circumstance. This is a notion of internal standard gone wild. It also looks as if the state has to be able to take account of all possible circumstances, but that is not a well-defined totality. In some circumstances, indeed, we might not know how to ascribe understanding. We might just not know what to say. These are ways more or less subtle in which the range and variegation of our practices might be exploited at the stage in the argument when it is still open what the relation of a putative state to the manifestations could be. When that is, we are still talking of the as yet uncomprehended process in the yet unexplored medium. If, however, we return to the scientific objection with its envisaged brain states and processes and its recourse to physical causation as linking state and manifestation, the upshot of that range and variegation is fairly straightforward. They show that we have little grasp of how to identify what is at issue in the brain, for it becomes hard to see how we could even begin to pick out the jobs that the supposed particular brain state was meant to do. That is to say, what causal rule qualifies the state to be the state of understanding? If the objector is saying that we could in principle discover that which biochemically causes us to behave in ways that a person who understands does. To this, we can now point out that the latter is simply not definite enough. There's no surveyable checklist of such behaviors and inclusion of or any particular behavior will depend on a not circumscribable range of features of the situation and on the person's particular circumstances and history. Again, what we are imagining in talking of a brain state identified as the understanding by its causal connection, location, becomes entirely unclear. A somewhat different cast can be put on the consideration of our practices as follows. The things we count as behavior associated with understanding are not grouped together by any scientific unity. We have no grasp on the collection in scientific terms. When we talk about manifestations of understanding, we are seeing or conceptualizing the behavior through the concept of understanding. It is only that concept that links them together. Wittgenstein seems to be exploiting this in remarks on philosophy of psychology. Paragraph 903 to 906. No supposition seems to me more natural than that there is no process in the brain correlated with associating or with thinking, so that it would be impossible to read off thought processes from brain processes. I mean this: if I talk or write here, write there, as I assume, a system of impulses going out from my brain and correlated with my spoken or written thoughts. But why should the system continue further in the direction of the center? Why should this order not proceed, so to speak, out of chaos? Paragraph 904. It is thus perfectly possible that certain psychological phenomena cannot be investigated psychologically, because physiologically nothing corresponds to them. Paragraph 906. The prejudice in favor of psychophysical parallelism is a fruit of primitive interpretations of our concepts. That is, if we look at all of the things that we call manifestations of understanding, we find no physical or physiological regularity in them. Hence, there's no reason to expect a physical systematicity in understanding if you eliminate all the mental notions. What are you left with by way of data? What you have left to do to do the science on is very little indeed. And I think that could be an excellent little point to put a pointer on. Very little indeed. A little phrase, a little word. I got some quotes here. Little stretch. Let's see here. So we know where we stopped on page 119. Please take a note. And all of a sudden, it has become as difficult could be. But all the same, this is so decisive. This is the paper house that psychology, psychiatry, and old-time fashioned neurology was built on. And it all fell already unsettled for the entirety of Nachlass. You can find the problem on page 114. And the internal fork is deeply connected to who is doing the comparison. So these people who don't have a memory of tones, whatever memories, they have internal mental forks. But who's doing the comparison? How does that happen? Did anyone think of that? No. No one has ever thought of that. Until now, that is, or till this was written, or we can read the whole last sentence and a bit more, the penultimate as well. Does she have internal ordered pairs of tuning forks which give her the standards for higher and lower, so that she may compare her tuning forks with the tone she heard? And now to the conundrum. But how does that help, since she still has to compare the tone with a member of the ordered pair? How on earth will the comparison be made? With what? By whom? When? And if we go to page 115, we can look even closer into this. The internal, and this is the second paragraph on that page, the internal standard is supposed to give us the means to identify items. But without practices and abilities for the internal standard is also meant to operate by itself in a self-sufficient manner. If it were not, it would be odious. Why not settle for practices and abilities themselves? It hardly adds explanatory value to say, instead of, she can recognize that as a middle C. She has a permanently resident mental tuning fork at middle C and can recognize when a tune is the same as that. So in short, the internal mental determinant is imagined on the model of external standards. Let me rephrase that to make it absolutely clear. In the outside world, we have sort of tuning forks that are a standard. To make new ones and to know where they are, we need those standard ones. And here there is a misconstruction. We think that there needs to be an internal fork, which is a standard which we can compare with. But it's not clear how and who we are. Homunculus, where does this happen? Inside the black box? And how would it be possible to make a comparison inside of the head where there is no sound? To my knowledge, the brain is silent. And here we have, at the very end of that, it is just the idea that recognition must involve comparison to a standard. Wittgenstein's point is to expose its incoherence. It simply does not work. And this he wrote in the 50s, late 40s, long before we sort of came to that in neurology and the science of cognition, well ahead of his time. And his arguments are even stronger. And the interlocutor further down at paragraph 95 says, I don't mean that what I do now in grasping something determines the future use causally and as a matter of fact of experience, but that in a queer way. The use itself is in some sense present, and Wittgenstein agrees that causal notions are not at issue. So the use is present, but causal notions, they are not. They have no place to be. What do we have instead? Well, let's jump to the next page. Second paragraph, 7 lines down. And I will go direct into the sentence. But in fact, a major part of Wittgenstein's considerations are to get us to see the enormous variety of features that play a role in our ascriptions of understanding or lack of understanding. And the dependence on these peculiarities of the context in which the ascriptions is made. And that's an enormity that's get covered up by just saying that there is a causal connection to something we call the inner. Actually, the inner is a cornucopia of complexities, enormously complex, fascinating. Not all of it is accessible to us. Some of it is not out there, other than potentially. Looking further down, we have examples. Different performances are required of new learners and old hands. That is to learn how to tune in. And it will cover this and much more: character traits, mental states of all kinds. In Johnston's book, there are covering at least 60. There are at least a couple of thousands of them. Intentional, emotional, and perceptual. All of this, Johnston counts another 100 each. Of course, there are millions of them. And personal history of the subject can be relevant. So the claimage in the article is nothing but naive. It's naive beyond any realization or any idea of a scientific, easy answer to this question, and that it should be a causal explanation, largely simplified beyond belief the reality. You can also use the Nobel Prize winners and Carlo Rovelli. It is global, it's not local. Just that the local indicated here is far from sensible. It's a simplification beyond belief. And on the next slide, you see the homunculus we've been speaking. 10 lines down. It begins to look as if in each instant the state must include, in some sense of include, something answering to any feature that could possibly arise in any circumstance. This is a notion of internal standard gone wild. And that weird thing can also take account of all possible circumstances, which is even more nuts. And I think the nice paragraphs that speak so clearly, and I underline them, that have to wait for the next time. Maybe I'll reread them next time. Kalle, it's difficult time for you to jump in here, but you're most welcome.
Thank you. Let's go to page 111 that we had on previous lecture. I think the key phrase is nothing is hidden. So this is almost what would you say, a jab against Freud.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yes, Freud claims some sort of homunculus as well. Although Freud doesn't enter into this discussion, he is also making the same problematic thing. For him, the homunculus is the unconscious. And let me clarify the unconscious. The unconscious doesn't participate in anything. It has no participation in the outer nor in the inner or with any doings or wants. Okay, sorry.
Mm-hmm. So let's discuss it's page 115, the last paragraph. Here, this box. About causality. So let me compare it with the butterfly effect from chaos theory. So it says that if a butterfly, what do you say, flips? How do you say it in English? If a butterfly
The butterfly flaps its wings.
flaps its wings, it can create a storm or a hurricane. And here, do we have causality or do we not have causality? Well, in Gauss theory, there is no difference between, our fractal theory, there's no difference between sizes. So butterfly is as big as an elephant. But on the other hand, we know in real life, a butterfly cannot move an elephant nor a hurricane. It cannot have any effect. So we could say that, but so in Gauss theory, we have both causality and we don't have causality. Why do we have causality? Yes, as it theory says, there is no difference in size between, let's say, an elephant and a butterfly.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. Very good. It questions the idea that size matters.
Mm-hmm. But
And
it,
that causality in some ways is size dependent. Very good. Very good.
but on the other hand, we could say that in this comparison with size matters and it does not matter at the same time. Because we know in real life, if a butterfly comes against an elephant, it doesn't have a chance at all. But in fractality, it does have a chance, so to say. It can cause damage, so to say, a butterfly. But what does it have? The move of a butterfly does have can have a causal effect, but at the same time, it does not have a causal effect. So that's my point. And what does it? What is the relevance to this discussion by Wittgenstein? Well, so let me see if we can together perhaps try to understand what is at issue here. So if we have, let's say, a hurricane, then we know perhaps the the cause could be the butterfly. But Wittgenstein is not interested in finding the original cause, or in this case, it would be the butterfly inside us. That is something that happened in our childhood, as Freud would say.
I would say, and this is just a tryout, so excuse me. This is difficult, and it's. We should also mention to the listeners, it's late in the afternoon, but it's very good of you, Kalle, to bring in chaos theory, because what Wittgenstein says when these persons are using the word causality, underneath there is a much bigger complexity than they have any. They don't cover the complexity that is underneath. You could call it a chaotic complexity of incredible amount of states and differences. It's a oversimplification of causality where they miss out on one big thing, and when we look underneath that misunderstanding, and that misunderstanding is of course who compares the two the two different things? Who does the comparison? Underneath that, we find even more, an enormous amount of complexity, almost like chaos. Yeah, it's very good.
But on the other hand, there is nothing hidden.
Nothing is hidden, but not all can be accessible to us. It could, at some instance, the things could show themselves in some future event, in some circumstances, whereas the hiddenness in Freud, for instance, is forever. It's forever. It would never.
Yes. Yeah. You made an important point. Let's say that you have a hurricane and you want to know the cause. You could never ever establish that it was a butterfly who caused it. It's ridiculous to find the culprit. And okay, so to say, to repeat what you said, yes, things are hidden, but they are not accessible to us. There is not a hidden, but there is not a hidden. Oh, what did you say? There is not a hidden, but they are accessible to us.
They could become, at some instance, accessible to us in some certain circumstance, whereas the subconscious or that or this comparison thing, that's hidden for good. It can never come out.
You mean comparison between what?
Yeah. How that will happen, how that will work.
Let me read this phrase slowly on here. I don't mean that what I do know in grasping something determines the future use causally and as a matter of experience, but that in a queer way, the use itself is in some sense present. And Wittgenstein agrees that causal notions are not at issue.
Yeah. At least I would say, to help your understanding, not causal notions in the simplified way is not an issue, but enormous complexity that goes way beyond what we normally mean with causality. And the presence of that, but that in a queer way, and this is a tricky one, the use itself is in some sense present. By that, I will try to rephrase that. Just give me a chance. I don't know if it's going to be good. You can think of the use as a sort of doing, an action, a skill. So he's indirectly pointing to the ones who can tell one term from another. They have learned that. They have been born with a complexity inward that makes it easier for them to learn it, but it's also the case that they have learned it. And it's also in the situation as well. It cannot be sort of taken away from the situation per se. One could say, and this is also a hint here, everything participates. All these enormous amount of different things in the inside do participate. The constructor of the idea of an internal tuning instrument haven't taken that into consideration. What they do say is an oversimplification And you could say that Goldfarb is pointing to, look, these things are much more complex. It's not enough just to say that there is an internal tuning thing without saying who tuned that, where is it, and who is doing the comparison. So underneath what looks like something that we should accept, there is a causal reason. Wittgenstein is saying under the concept causal reason, a complexity is underneath that is ignored by the word causal reason. So the problem of scientifically looking at internal states or what they cause is far from simple. And the problem is conceptual more, to how we use these things rather than a simple opening up the skull and see what we find inside. Oh, look here, we found an internal tuning instrument somewhere. And that has actually been done this night for you who wants to study this more. And I think that book is in the internet. That's Paul Johnston's Rethinking the Inner. And Johnston is not using a tuning instrument, he's using a clock. And I think the discussion about the clock in science has ended, but for at least 60 years, they were looking for an internal clock somewhere. And nobody was thinking, who will check that clock and who will read it off? And all those problems. At bottom, there is a oversimplification of something that is enormously complicated, and many aspects we cannot even point out. They are sort lying in the implicit. You missed a piece, Milda, Kalle. I can recommend that you go back when I put it on the net simply.
So let's perhaps resume the point about hiddenness. So Wittgenstein says on page, in this paper, page 111, nothing is hidden. So we shouldn't, the point with this expression is that we shouldn't try to find the primal cause, because probably it's impossible to find it.
Yeah, definitely.
So what would Wittgenstein recommend instead?
Well, the point of Goldfarb's article is to show that Wittgenstein is not anti-scientistic, is anti-scientism. And Wittgenstein says, continue with science, but in this particular, when it comes to psychology, I think, and understanding, we need to be careful. We haven't checked into what we're meaning when we say understanding, or we haven't checked what we mean by an inner state. Look a bit more careful to those things.
And there was actually, speaking of chaos, because himself uses the word chaos on here in paragraph 903. We could mention it as a last thing here. I could read from here. I mean, this, if at all right, there is, I assume, a system of impulses going out from our brain and correlate with my spoken or written thoughts. But why should the system continue further in the direction of the center? Why should this order not proceed, so to say, out of chaos?
Yeah.
So everything goes in many directions.
Definitely. This is why I wanted to save these gems here, but you're more than welcome to them. It's very good, Kalle. You have excellently understood. Very
Thank you,
good.
thank you.
And this is proving it more than fantastic. I think it was a good long good go through here. What do you say, Kalle? Should we end here?
Yes, absolutely.
And
No.
we end while we are on top.
Mm.
Thank you, Kalle Lundahl. Thank you, everyone, for participating and listening in. Have a very pleasant day, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Do take care. Bye bye for now.